This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with Jon Levy, who is the founder of the Influencer Dinners, now I guess called the Influencer Labs, also the author of a couple of books. The most recent book is called You're Invited, The Art and Science of Cultivating Influence. And then you've got this previous book, which is called The 2 a.m. Principle.
Holy cow, you managed to get a copy.
The Science of Adventure. It's got this nice little thing in here.
Isn't that super fun? Yeah, for those of you who can't see this, the cover of that book actually has a rotator built into it, and you can spin it and get different adventures to do in your life. So it's like a game and book. It won Best Design Book of the Year. Super proud of it.
Well, so I read the more recent book first and then went back and read the earlier book. And it was interesting because I could see the origins of the second book in the first book because in a way, the first book was about architecting, your own experience to facilitate, adventure and influence. And then later, the second book is really all about, architecting other people's experiences in a way.
Yeah.
To facilitate adventure and influence, but it's really much more about crafting an adventure for other people. And I think that the second book there's an element of it which is as an individual, right? How can you do this? But then you also talk about how corporations and organizations can architect experiences that will be memorable for people. And as somebody who not only loves to throw a lot of dinner parties, but I also organize a lot of these kind of immersion trips for people visiting Silicon Valley. I found a lot of what you were saying to be, it's common sense, but kind of common sense only for the people who do it an awful lot, right?
Yeah. It's people often talk about my work as, oh, I had a hunch about that, but I never had the words to describe it. And so it's, I spend a lot of time thinking about, what do we believe is true that just is absolutely total BS? And then what is it that if we were aware of it would make us actually more effective? And so I think the first book does that really well when it comes to living an exciting and interesting life. And the second one is really ask this question. If we want to have an effect on our life, if we want to really accomplish something, and you listen to most of the advice that's out there, it doesn't actually work. Like if you listen to all like the big gurus, if you were to do exactly what Bill Gates did, it wouldn't work for you. Mm-hmm. So the question is kind of what does? And what we really notice is that relationships define everything. And you don't need lots of money for relationships. You don't even need to be like super charismatic or good looking to have friendships. It's really something that's kind of universal. And I think that that's kind of one of these unique things that if we can understand the mechanics of how a relationship works, just like how an adventure works, suddenly things become possible that otherwise would be impossible.
Well, you put a sort of scientific, I guess it's a pseudo-scientific, right, lens around it with this influence equation, right, where you talk about the importance of connection and trust.
It's a model, right? So like the classic statement is that all models are wrong, just some are useful. I'm hoping this one's kind of useful, right? So any descriptor we give of the universe doesn't actually encompass the universe, but like maybe we could give a description that helps us understand what's going on to some degree. And so I looked at the really hard science and did my own research. I do research alongside a very well-known neuroscientist at Kellogg. And we were able to find some pretty staggering things. And in aggregate, it really tends to seem to pan out that our relationships define anything we actually care about, from human longevity to team success to like company stock value, employee sick days, profitability, like all these things. So it's kind of wild.
Well, in social sciences, we try to separate out, selection from treatment, right? We're trying to figure out, are the people who graduate from Harvard successful because they, Harvard's really good at selecting the people who are going to be successful, or, does Harvard actually do anything? And I think in your books, you're talking about both pieces, right? On the one hand, you have to choose the right people to hang out with, right? I mean,
yes.
you talk about, Nicholas Christakis' work, and, if you want to be fit, hang out with fit people. If you want to be interesting, hang out with interesting people. But then, if that was all there was to it, then, you probably wouldn't need 90% of the, well, you wouldn't need, I guess you would need a bunch of the advice, because otherwise people wouldn't want to hang out with you, right? But a lot of the advice is about how to shape an experience that brings out things from people, or makes people, kind of brings out at least certain characteristics of people that will make it more likely that the positive effects will kind of rub off on you.
Mm-hmm. Or mitigate those negative effects, right? So I think that you're absolutely right. One of the and I think Christakis' work is actually a great example. You brought up this idea that, is Harvard really good at selecting the people that become successful, or is it something that happens at Harvard? And for Harvard Law School, I think there was this fantastic study that looked at effectiveness of lawyers relative to which law school they went to. And as prestigious as Harvard Law is, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. You could go to any decent law school and get the same results. Now, you might not get a clerkship for a Supreme Court justice because they're snobby and will only, for the most part, take the Harvard kids. But it doesn't mean that those people are any better in any way, shape, or form. So in Christakis and Fowler's work that you pointed to, they asked this kind of funny question. It was like the early 2000s, I think. And they said, hey, obesity is kind of discussed as an epidemic. Does it spread from person to person like a cold, or is it a percentage of the population? And in general, what they found was that if you have a friend who's obese, your chances of obesity increase by, I think it was 45%. Your friends who do not know them have a 20% increased chance, and their friends have a 5% increased chance. And so we aren't used to thinking of the virality of human behavior, right? If I want to, be more creative, then I should just hang out with creatives. Or for me, it was, I kept setting my alarm for 6 a.m. to go to the gym and then never following through with it. I kept hitting snooze and hating myself for it. And I realized I should just hang out with athletes, and then instead of eating a tub of popcorn at the movies, I'll go work out as part of just my social scene. And so the question is, why does this happen? And so I think part of it is both sides of that Harvard equation. It's, I make friends with people in the environments that I'm in. So if we both go to the same gym, we're more likely to be friends, but we're also more likely to be fitter in general, right? So that's part of it. Birds of a feather flock together. It's called homophily. The other part of it is that if I am going to a meal with you and you order a dessert, there's a really good chance I'm going to eat some of that dessert.
Yep.
Whereas otherwise I wouldn't. And that's where behavior becomes contagious. Because if I start spending a lot of time with people who are really fit, my personal image and standard of what fit looks like changes and shifts towards more to maybe the muscular side. And then I change my behavior to match that. Whereas if I start hanging out with people who are really negligent of their bodies, then my standards change and their habits become my habits. So I think it comes from both sides.
Well, the flip side of that is the impact that you have on other people, right? So people who hang out with you, whatever it is that you bring to the table is going to rub off on them. And so I was wondering if you gave a lot of thought to that, right? Especially in the 2 a.m. principle. I mean, are these co-conspirators that you mentioned in the book, I mean, did they, were they born or made? I mean, did you kind of get them to start doing these crazy things that you would do, jumping into moving limousines and crashing parties and, although I think,
battling Kiefer Sutherland and Drunken Jenga.
Right? Yeah. So, I mean, do you think a lot about the impact? I mean, certainly I do. I mean, as a teacher, I have a very distinct mission, which is to infuse in my students certain characteristics, which I think of as virtues. I mean, and you don't say this explicitly, but I think that you believe that this thirst for adventure is in many ways a virtue, right? I mean, you talk about curiosity. I mean, Do you think of these? Do you think of this as a virtue, or do you think of this just as a, a personality trait?
So I think that I see it as a virtue up until a limit, right? The let's take the extreme cases and work backwards, if that's okay. I have a huge respect for, let's say, Olympians, right? The number of years of effort, the training, the pain they put themselves through, all for like a shot at representing our country. And then if you actually look, depression rates are really high, suicide rates are really high. Finding a purpose after the Olympics is really difficult. And so, do I have an admiration for them? Yes. Would I want my child to be an Olympian? No. Because I just don't think that there's a benefit at the extreme. And I view adventure in the same way. I think some is really great. The level that I was going, oh man, my parents must have been freaking out. Right? There's climbing Everest and being the first to the peak, amazing. The number of people who had to die along the way, it's more risk than I would recommend. Mm. So in the book, I really go into this idea that adventure is a fantastic, fantastic process to live an interesting, exciting, potentially creative life. It's a fantastic way to bond with people that you adventure with. And more importantly, it is an incredible way to build the muscle of social skills and tolerance for discomfort and social discomfort. These are skills that are essential in just about anything you'd want to do in life. But in the extreme, it's probably like being an Olympian. You're putting yourself in a lot of risk for questionable value.
But is adventure sort of is it an end in itself, or is it a means to an end? I mean, I think you kind of flip back and forth. So partly, you're just trying to, have this exciting, interesting, stimulating stream of experiences. But then I think, you also talk about how this helps you, not only kind of personally, but professionally, right? So, I mean, to what extent is, do you think people should be maximizing this flow of novelty, right? And to what extent is it really more, okay, you can be more successful in terms of achieving your goals, and to what extent, are they more or less the same thing? Like your goal is community, your goal is connection, your goal is trust, and these, the adventures that you specifically emphasize are ones that involve other people. I mean, well, you're running with the bulls may be something that's more solitary.
Right, yeah.
But even when you're jumping off a bridge, you're jumping off a bridge with someone, right?
So I think that the important thing to realize is that every piece of research I've ever come across on the topic of kind of the value of human connection continues to show that having close social ties is a better prescription for your health than taking statins. Not that I'm recommending anybody getting off their meds, but like nothing comes close to the value of deep social ties and being integrated into a community. These things have an incredible ability to reduce stress, increase quality of health. It's how people find their jobs, how people get support in difficult times. Like, there is not a thing as human beings isn't touched by this. Yeah. And so for me, the idea that, hey, I can somehow separate that from anything else is kind of funny. It's like asking how important is air. Like, we just need it. And those people who don't have any meaningful relationships tend to die significantly younger. They tend to suffer from more anxiety and depression and lower rates of productivity. And so if you want to be effective, if you want to have a fantastic career, if you want to accomplish anything that matters to you, it's going to be really tough to do that without meaningful social ties.
Now, look, there's different types of social ties, right? I mean, some are deeper than others. A lot of the things that you're talking about is, you can establish some form of social tie, relatively quickly, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think if you go to law school, you're going to have 300 people that you're going to be immersed with, without really making any kind of effort to some degree. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not really what most people are experiencing. I mean, most people, if you want to have social ties, you don't inherit this community that you might have inherited in the Middle Ages. I mean, you have to be very proactive about constructing social ties. So, do you think that people are, I don't know, lacking in, I mean, the courage to create these social? I mean, I notice even myself. I'm sometimes more reluctant to pick up the phone if I want to book tickets and I can't book them online, and I got to pick up the phone and call some human being. I feel very reluctant to do that. That's I don't think 20 years ago, obviously, I wouldn't have felt any reluctance to pick up the phone. But I
Yeah.
mean, do you think it's harder now to create these
I
networks of
think
ties?
that there's two factors that play into each other that both make it harder and easier. So human beings have this characteristic, and in fact, most living systems do, something called anti-fragility, which is there's some things that are fragile, like a champagne glass. You drop it, it'll shatter. Then there's things that are also anti-fragile. You apply pressure to them, they actually get stronger, like our muscles. And so when it comes to our social skills, not only are they anti-fragile, meaning that as you practice them more, you get better and stronger at them, but they atrophy when you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially in a post-ish pandemic situation, our social skills have atrophied to a large degree. But we're also in an era where there's so many systems and even actual people that baby us that prevent us from actually needing to develop those skills. So when your mom is involved in every aspect of your social life from a young age, and you don't need to learn how to make friends, and you don't need to learn to talk to strangers because mommy is helicoptering or daddy is helicoptering around you, then yeah, you're going to be weaker. And that's going to be significantly weaker between generations now. Because even your generation versus your students, we're talking about a wildly different social structure. Yeah, you were happy to call a cell phone because it meant that you didn't have to walk out onto the street, find a newspaper, so that you could get the answer to something like when are the movie times, right? You're happy to call a theater and get an answer. Now you go online, and that's become so easy that it doesn't require you to push the social skill. It doesn't require you to strengthen that muscle. And so I think that we're facing this whole issue of anti-fragility. And ever since about 1950, right when post-war sentiment from World War II was beginning to die down and the television entered the home, we see a massive decline in people participating in social groups and their number of friends. Mm-hmm. And so this is a cultural trend. Yes, it's harder now because we've weakened our muscles, and we've made it really, really easy to stay at home and press play on Netflix. But
so do you think that we need personal trainers for our social skills, right? And maybe even, like with kids, right? The kids are sent off to basketball camp. I mean, should we send them off to, social skills camp, right? And have a bunch of, weightlifting stations that they have to go to learn how to, like, okay, here's how you go up and introduce yourself to somebody in the playground. Here's how you introduce,
I think that
say hello to the person in the store.
I think you actually bring up a really great point. So the way we would make friends, I would assume, when we were young, was we just grew up with people. Like, I'm talking tens of thousands of years, right? We were part of the same
before
tribe.
our times.
Yeah, just barely. I'm much older than I look. So you just grew up with people, and those social ties grew over time. That was your tribe. Nothing to really think about. As cities,
now, to be fair,
grew,
those people might not have encountered, strangers as often as we do, right?
I mean, we encounter strangers anytime we leave our home, most likely.
Yeah.
unless you live in a small town, right? So if you're in a major urban area, you probably come in contact with a stranger. Now, as cities grew and populations grew, then you would kind of come in contact with more people, but we're not naturally inclined to just talk to strangers. It's not like how our species evolved. So if you really look, people become friends kind of based on one, proximity. So if we're in each other's orbit in some way, and two, through joint activities or common ground, right? So shared activities, culture, history, interest. If both of us are stamp collectors, we're much more likely to be friends. And so I think what we're going to be seeing, and kind of one of the solutions here, is look at organizations like Meetup and people needing to find groups that have a shared interest. It's going to be from joining like a soccer league and an art class, because that's how tribes are formed, through communities. And I do think that we need people to help us with this, frankly. But I don't think it'll come in the form of a community coach. I think it'll come in the form of like Soul Cycle for socialization, right? Like it's going to be part of our subscription fees that we pay every month, and we pay X amount for a class to be part of or participate in a community.
Well, I was wondering if you could tell us just about the origin of the dinner party that you
sure.
created. I mean, because I when I think of you, I think, oh, he's the dinner party guy, right? That's sort of how that's your the claim to fame that brought me to your work, and just talk about how that came about, because I'm a big dinner party guy. I love throwing dinner parties, but I've also found that it's a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult. In some ways, when you're in a bigger city with busier people. I remember when I taught university at a small university town, throwing together a dinner party was super easy, and my response rate was pretty high. And when you're in a place like San Francisco Bay Area, I mean, people are.
The Bay Area is the hardest. I'll be honest. I throw dinner parties all across the country, now extended into many countries, and the hardest place by far is the Bay Area. I think that people just have this cultural thing about being over-scheduled and having to hustle and become the next unicorn or whatever it is. Let's not use San Francisco as an example. But I agree. So I'll answer your question like this. Do you know in TV shows where they show a kid who's really geeky and kind of isolated and the parents are worried that they don't have any friends? I admired those kids for being so social growing up. I was really unpopular. And I was into tech and geek stuff before any technology was cool, right? There weren't really many video game systems and things like that, like there are now, where you could be a professional gamer. I grew up geeky. And
so if you grew up 20 years later, you'd have like 1 million followers on
exactly.
Twitch,
no,
right?
That's it. Like geek culture now rules. It's having a moment. I just missed all that by a few years, and so the problem was I was reached about my late 20s, and I'd made some friends, but I wasn't like an impressive person by any stretch of the imagination. I was sitting in a seminar, personal development training, and the seminar leader said that the fundamental element that defines the quality of our lives are the people we surround ourselves with and the conversations that we have with them. And I got really curious. If having those social ties is so critical, what would cause the people I admire to actually want to interact with me? And after doing a bunch of research, I came to the conclusion that the answer would be to convince people to come to my home, cook me dinner, wash my dishes, clean my floors. And the weirdest thing is, I've been doing this for 12 years now. Oddly, they thank me for it. So I host 12 people at a time at an anonymous dinner. They're literally not allowed to talk about what they do or give their last name. They cook a meal for me. And when they sit down to eat, we play a guessing game to guess what people do professionally. And we are almost always wrong. And then we find out we're sitting with Olympians and Nobel laureates and celebrities and Grammy Award winners and the occasional prime minister or princess or anyone else you could imagine. It's industry leaders, people who really have the respect of their industry. I've hosted probably over 2,500 people at 284 dinners as of Tuesday, and 11 cities in 4 countries, and we keep expanding. And so
now here's the thing: if everybody knows, I know I used to use the Evite, right? And people would always check and say, well, who else is coming, right?
Yeah.
Now in your parties, like no one can check to see who else is
No.
coming.
I don't, and the funny thing is, I don't even know. So after years of doing this, I said I'm actually not qualified to decide if somebody's an industry leader, because what do I know about astronomy? Like, it's not my area of expertise. So how would I know if somebody's a successful astronomer? And so we handed it over to a selection committee, and we have a research team, and I have a team of 4 people who all they do is this, and organize it for me. And I just go in and I run every single dinner.
Yeah, and what's funny about it is that the participatory element, right? This IKEA effect that you talk about. And, I worked in restaurants, so I always thought, oh, when my guests show up, everything's going to be, table's going to be set, and, the candles are going to be lit and so forth. But, when I have my family and friend gatherings, that's never the case, right? We're all just kind of pitching in, and I get
hanging
people.
out in
And
the
I remember
kitchen
one time
talking
I was
to
throwing
you.
this, Yeah, and I remember one time I was throwing this dinner party when I first moved to this small university town, and I invited the dean of the law school over. And of course, I thought that if I said 7:30, that meant 8. So of course, he and his wife showed up at 7:30, and I was like in my underwear basically. And so I put them to work peeling potatoes. I got dressed and stuff, and they had a wonderful time, right? They really enjoyed it, and I realized, wow, people do want to be, they it gives them a feeling much more of a family environment. And of course they knew each other, but still it was this idea. I mean, if everybody's working, then you're not talking about like, what do you do? Instead you're, pass the potatoes. And in America, that is what we do, right? That's the first thing that we say when we meet someone is,
there's a few things, if I could point to in this. One is that if you're meeting somebody for the first time and you're sitting across the table from them, that's an interview. That's not if I'm taking a walk with you, or if I'm peeling potatoes, part of the nervous energy is occupied by the activity. And then if I have nothing to say, we can turn to the activity.
Yeah.
That is a much more natural way to interact. And if you actually think about it, if we're talking our evolution, I'm just guessing, I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm guessing on this, that we probably spent long periods of time working with either cattle or livestock of some kind, or going hunting, that was spent in silence, and then conversation, and then silence, and working the activity, and so on. And that seems like a much more natural way to engage with each other, rather than the pressure of like, okay, in this 30-minute block, we're going to find out everything about each other so that we like each other, so that we'll do business.
Yeah.
And that's weird. The second thing is, you pointed to this idea that in America, the first thing we talk about is our work. And I think that that's true within specific social circles. And that is when you do something that gives you so much, let's say, pleasure or status, that you have like a spiel about it, then I think it's more likely. And I point to the work of, Jonah Berger from University of UPenn. And he looked at car purchases. And what he found is that if you have like some fancy job, like you're a high-powered lawyer, then your car needs to be unique. It has to be different and stand out. If you are working class and you're like, a coal miner, or you work on the assembly line of something or whatever it is, you actually get more confidence if you have the same car as your neighbors. And I think the argument is twofold. One is it's probably a percentage of your income, so you want to feel like you've done something reliable, so you're happier when it's similar to other people because you feel good about the decision. The other side of it is a matter of identity. So if I have a job that's like, okay, I assemble the doors onto cars, that's probably less of the way I see myself as an identity. I probably see myself more as a sports fan of a specific team or the church I go to or whatever else it is that I'm involved in. So my job probably ranks lower on the self-identity aspect. The more my job is a part of who I see myself as, the more likely I would think people will go there. And then the more of a chance that there's an opportunity. Meaning if I'm a lawyer and you're a CEO of a company, there's more of a chance then for opportunity. If we're both in manufacturing cars or something like that, then like there isn't necessarily an opportunity to quote unquote network
Right.
because neither of us are in any position that it would matter.
Well, I mean, if you're mixing people high status and low status, it seems like an unequal trade, right? If people are obsessed with status and you throw them into an environment, I mean, if you go to a football game, you start talking to somebody, but you typically don't say, "What do?" You talk about, "Hey, well, what's the deal with that interception or whatever," right? And if you're out on a ski trip with somebody or you're on the lift with somebody, I mean, you probably start talking about the ski conditions and so forth, but then doesn't that deprive the high status people of the thing that they want the most, which is, praise and accolades and so forth? I mean, I guess it's different if you're bringing in nothing but all-stars, but, because it's an equal trade. But
I don't think that that's the thing that we strive for the most, though.
Mhm.
I would argue very simply that if you look at Maslow's higher order of needs, we're used to thinking at the base is food, water, shelter. But if you look, people are willing to starve themselves in order to fit in. People are willing to die for a cause in order to fit in, to be recognized, right? Maybe that's status, you could argue. Which means that for human beings, belonging is pretty critical. You want to look at our punishments, right? Aside from capital punishment, the biggest punishments we have are exile, which says you cannot be part of this community anymore, or solitary confinement, which says you are not fit to be around people anymore. And so the issue, I think, is that probably what we want more than anything is to belong. I think that if you really look what led us to survive as a species, is that we're not really very fast. We're definitely not very strong compared to most animals out there. Are we arguably smarter? Sure, to a large degree, but plenty of other animals use tools and communication and all that. We're just really, really good at working together. We're really good at surviving because we can come together in communities and packs and teams. And so I actually think that the most important thing is first to belong. Once you belong, status then probably becomes pretty important. But
yeah, and I think
oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, the other thing that comes up here is this cooking and work part, right? So I invited my cousin over for we're going to an event later this weekend, and
I wasn't invited.
Said, hey,
wow, so that's how it's going to be.
I was like, hey, I was like, we can have dinner before the play, and she was like, no, like I don't want you to have to cook and clean and all that stuff, yeah, you don't have to do that. And I was like, yeah, I actually like that. She's like, nah, you don't want to do that. And I realized, so I said to her, I was like, because this is one of my standard tropes that I talk about in class is like, there's got to and there's get to, right? And it's just completely it's totally up to you in your mind whether you've got to cook or you get to cook, right?
Yeah.
And it's it's completely a matter of perspective. And so, these folks who you have come and peel potatoes and stuff, right? Normally they think of this as something that they have to do and they don't really want to do it. But then, you flip it. And so now it's like, hey, it's something you get to do. And
That's a really great
I
point.
actually, one of when I used to,
I guess,
have
what is
these,
it? I Tom Sawyered
Go ahead.
them. Is that what it, or was it Huck Finn?
Yeah.
Where he's like, oh no,
Tom
I'm
Sawyer.
painting the fence, but it's too fun. You don't get to do this.
Right. Yeah. And so one thing I would do for some of my immersion programs, typically they would come from Europe for a week and they would not necessarily know each other very well. The very first day of the program, we would all go to there's a place here in Berkeley where for a fee, you can essentially cook your own meal in a restaurant style kitchen. And the guy who runs it, gives you some instructions, some recipes, ingredients, and then unleashes you. And then we all make our own dinner. And I remember, talking to the university folks who were paying for the whole thing. And they were like, wait, we have to pay this to make our own dinner? It's like the same price as going to the restaurant and having it served. They didn't understand like the point.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, this is actually going to be better. People are going to enjoy this more than they
far
would
more.
if
Yeah.
they just had a sit down dinner.
Oh, far, far, far more. The number of companies that have come to me asking me if we could do the dinner is ridiculous. And generally I say, no, what we can do is kind of design something that's custom to you and your organization, because it doesn't, you want your activities to like flow with your values. And clearly like some of those people aren't valuing quality time spent together or see the opportunity of that. So that's
So
super
can you
interesting.
talk about these corporate events, right? So I mean, you talk about discovery, engagement, membership, right? Well, first of all, I mean, I think it makes sense for employees, I suppose, to have this sense of membership. And but this is extended to a much larger group now. So Salesforce is famous for having Dreamforce, and so companies want their customers to feel like they're part of a community. They want their suppliers to feel like they're part of a community. They're independent software developers and distributors and channel partners. I mean, to what extent are companies, and brands like a source of identity and community now? And what do you,
I
mean,
think
do
it's
you think
huge.
that that's important?
Yeah, I think that it's huge. I think the issue is that, you keep hearing from brand marketers that brand loyalty is at an all-time low. That, what do you actually care which detergent you're using in most cases to clean your clothes? Especially if you're like sending it out, I couldn't care less. Which means that if I could have you experience a sense of belonging to the organization, to the brand, it's a matter of identity. It's that if my logo appears here, then you're on the inside of something. Then that's pretty incredible. I think actually a contemporary example that's really a little almost weird is, have you ever heard of the Bored Ape Yacht Club? The NFT company?
Yeah.
Right? People are spending like tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for
Well, a
these.
little bit less now.
Yeah. But when I asked why, they said, well, you get to own the thing. I was like, okay, great. Congrats. You own this thing that, I could have just downloaded for free. And then they said, but what's pretty extraordinary is the community events that they're running. And you use your ape to get into it. And now you have access to things that you normally don't. And that was the first time I kind of saw a bit of value around this idea of like a non-fungible token used in an interesting way. Is it's a marker for community, and you can sell your spot in the community if you want. That's fine. But I don't necessarily think you need an NFT for that. You can probably just have a centralized database to allow for the transactions. But I think that what we're really seeing is this emergence of companies trying to really build a direct relationship with customers and helping them organize. And historically, there are certain companies that have done it fantastically well. You look at Harley Davidson, Mud Runner, right? Or any of these like kind of crazy marathon-ish type activities. You look at the Cooper Mini has a fantastically strong community where people drive in and they come together and they show off their cars and what they did to them. So the companies that can really do that have a little bit more future proofing, right? If you're part of the Mini community and then you're thinking about getting a new car, if you give up your Mini, you're no longer part of that community.
Yeah.
And then an entire section of your identity and social circle is gone. And I remember hearing an interview with a flat earther. These people who believe that somehow still in the 2000s now, that the earth is flat. And what became clear was that he was very scientifically oriented, right? Was running experiment after experiment that wasn't proving his point that the earth is flat. And what really came to light is that if he accepts that the earth is round, he is losing his entire social circle.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so it's easier to just keep spending money on these experiments that don't work than to be alone. And we kind of keep seeing that. You know, we see that people who are closeted and gay would rather stay closeted than lose their community because they wouldn't be accepted. We see, you know, it's kind of wild that the community of Amish is so strong that kids go out at 16 on Roomspringer and experience the world, and then they're like, okay, back to, you know, horse and buggy, because the community's values are so strong and being part of it is so important.
Only about half of them go back.
That's still insane. Like,
Yeah.
if you literally grew up without a smartphone, without knowing that technology exists, and suddenly I introduce you to vodka and cell phones, like the fact that all those people are going back, that's like a pretty wild thing, right? And listen, I don't drink very often. I try to avoid my cell phone a lot, but like still, it's just such an amazing world. And then to close yourself off from that by choice is pretty incredible. And I would argue that it's a factor of belonging.
Yeah. Well, so to what extent do you require physical? So, you know, I think people do incorporate brands into their identity. You know, you see people walking around with Abercrombie and Fitch shirts, and you know, they're
That was like, more in like the 90s. Yeah. Now it's like,
yeah, whatever. I mean, you know, you have your logos and stuff, but they don't really have, you know, Abercrombie and Fitch, you know, conventions and conferences and so forth.
Yep.
I mean, maybe people sort of identify each other when they're in the school, you know, in school classroom, like, oh, you know, you're someone like me. But you know, there are, and so people care about the brand and so forth. But this idea of having physical communities, like the BMW car club or whatever. I know I have a lot of friends in the wine business, and they have events at their wineries, and they have you know, subscriptions and so forth. But then I remember reading about how SoFi, which is the company that does these student loan refis and so forth, you know, they were holding these social events. And I thought, well, this is kind of nuts. Like, I mean, what kind of community can you build around, yeah, I refinanced my student loan with the same company you did. I mean, and I thought it was just a little weird, but the founder had a pretty convincing story as to why this might make sense.
So I think that there's a few reasons. One is I'm not sure if their actual strategy was to build community, although community is a really popular term these days. In a situation like Sophie, it might be more word of mouth, realizing that like the best potential client is if I invite you to an event, you will bring two of your friends to this ultra cool event, and it's a word of mouth strategy, maybe.
Yeah, so that's like a vodka. That's like a vodka sponsoring a, you know.
Yeah, it's the
event,
halo
right?
effect. It's hoping to be part of the conversation. I can understand it, and it actually might pay for itself, depending on how many people keep coming to these things. The community also might exist for a greater purpose, right? And that purpose might be financial freedom or independence or responsibility. And then in time, as Sophie, however they pronounce it, keeps growing, they might be able to then market additional products to them. And in that case, it's a fantastic strategy because then you have a really loyal audience of people who, over the next 50 years, when it comes time to get a loan for their home and loan for this and all these other kind of life events, they're around. They could be there to partner with a life insurance company, so that when this target audience is looking for life insurance or whatever it is, and they're having kids, they can get it. So I think that especially if you look long term and the value that a community provides, but it's there. The issue is that most companies, when they say community, they actually mean audience, and they're very different.
Yeah.
An audience is a one-way conversation.
I participated in an event that was organized by Coca-Cola, and they had invited all of the CMOs of all their kind of channel partners, right, from all the fast food places and all of the, the channel, all the restaurants and whoever was serving Coke, right? And the conference, there was really very little discussion about carbonated beverages at this thing.
Yeah,
it was all about, they had some novelists and some thought leaders, and then we had some events and lots of things. And I think these folks really did see themselves as a community, but you argue also that it's not so much putting people in a room and having them passively kind of listen to things, but the more they actually do stuff, the more community they will they will feel like they're a part of. So if in terms of hosting these events, I want to circle back from the corporate to the individual. Could you, if you were to summarize sort of the ways in which people can become more proactive about building community in their lives, what would you suggest? Right? How do they start?
So if I were to oversimplify community, it would be a consistent opportunity to engage with people around a topic. Like that's, and here's the important parts. Engage, meaning you're an active participant, and a topic. Most communities exist around a thing. So there are lots of people who like to knit. I'm not joining that community because I'm not a knitter, right? But you need your thing so that people can identify that they're actually part of that community. Otherwise, you're just friends. Or you could kind of build a community around the fact that you're having events, but then it lacks identity to some degree. So if you want to be more active at cultivating community around you, you need consistent opportunities for people to engage with each other. So it's not just about me knowing you and me knowing your friend and me knowing 20 other people. It's how do I get them to know each other? Now, regardless of how introverted you are, you can probably handle going to coffee with two friends that might not know each other. That way they bond. And the more bonds there are between the people in your life, the more a sense of belonging you'll have. Because then when I talk to you about Steve, you know who Steve is.
Right.
And
so you don't want to just promote a hub and spoke model of
Precisely.
community, right? You want to
Yeah.
facilitate connections between the different nodes and the branches, right?
Precisely. So in a hub and spoke model, you're connected to a whole slew of people that just don't know each other. And that's actually a really weak place to be, because then if you disappear, there's nothing going on. The more interactions there are between the people, those spokes, then eventually you end up with a network. That network is where that community is where real opportunities arise. Because then, as we discussed in that example of obesity with Christakis and Fowler, the same kind of effect exists for happiness, marriage and divorce rates, smoking habits, voting habits. And so everything has the potential to spread through these communities. That's how people find out about jobs, get married, meet people, participate in activities, find hobbies. And the more of those interactions that exist consistently, the more familiar people are to each other and the closer they will tend to feel. That is accentuated the more effort they invest into one another, that IKEA effect. This idea that we care more about our IKEA furniture because we had to assemble it. So my recommendation, regardless of how introverted or extroverted or shy you might be, just start gathering people. Or go and participate in other people's gatherings. Let them do the heavy lifting. You might want to find a version of me, the type of person who can't help but gather people constantly, and just stay in their orbit, because then you'll constantly be invited to stuff and contribute and participate. That's what it takes. Or go on to Meetup and find one of the 8,000 meetups in your area that you could participate in, and just keep going, because this is clearly somebody who organizes this that cares about building community. And so that's my recommendation. Either start building your own or start participating in others, or both.
Well, you have this metaphor in a book, which it's a kind of a riff on Hume to some extent, where you've got the elephant and the rider, and the elephant is a lot stronger than the rider, and and you say, if you want to make sure that the elephant doesn't charge off and leave you behind, then you need to create an environment where the elephant has kind of fewer options. Right? So this seems like kind of architecting a world in which it's easier for you to achieve your goals. So how is if your goal is sociability, if your goal is community, how can you architect your world so that you're more likely to do this? You don't have to have the willpower. I mean, part of it's about surrounding yourself with people that you want to be like, but how do you architect it so that you're more likely to meet those people?
That's such a great question. I think that the first thing is that you want to ask the people in your social circle who the most connected person they know is. And they'll probably all point to the same person, or you'll get a few names. And you want to connect with those people. And the reason is that if they exist as a central hub for social interaction, they probably really like engaging and connecting people. And get to know them, spend a lot of time with them. And ask them, by the way, who should I meet? Who do you think I'd be good friends with? Because they have such a wealth of contacts. And that takes the pressure off of you. Because otherwise, if you say, okay, I'm going to throw a big dinner party or something, you're like, oh my God, how am I going to confirm 12 people? Forget that. Make your life easy. Get somebody else to set you up on friend dates. And that's like a great first step, because otherwise you'll stop yourself. If it's not on your calendar, if you're not setting up an actual meeting and time, you'll put it off until you think it needs to be perfect. We have to do the perfect dinner party. I can't do it yet. I keep thinking about it. Just go out there and meet some people. And then keep it really informal and keep gathering. Say, hey, let's go to a coffee shop. Let's take a walk. Let's do a workout class together. Build yourself up to when you have enough contacts that you feel like, oh, wow, I'd really like them all to meet each other. Here's a bigger opportunity to do that. But my recommendation is always keep it small at the beginning, because otherwise you are going to end up feeling like it has to be perfect, and then it's going to stop you from doing anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when it comes to dinner parties, sometimes perfect can get in the way of the good.
Yeah.
Jon, thank you so much for joining me. You're Invited is the most recent book, also the 2 a.m. Principle. So check these out if you want to kind of break things up a little bit and add a little sense of adventure, and certainly improve your social connectivity. Hope to talk to you again sometime soon, Jon.
This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on and for doing such thorough research. That's super impressive. Much appreciated.
This is Unsilo, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.